Somerville, Massachusetts, late summer 1997. The air carried a familiar scent of honeysuckle and warm brick, mingling with the faint mustiness of old family furniture and the bittersweet memory of holidays filled with laughter that seemed impossibly distant now. As Margaret Lawson, a high school history teacher with a fondness for World War II-era documentaries and letters written by soldiers, climbed the narrow staircase up to the dusty attic of her late grandmother's row house, an attic she had never dared enter until now, where every floorboard groaned beneath her weight, as if murmuring that some memories were better left undisturbed, even though she had always known the truth. Confronting the past is exactly how we honor it. Sunlight, golden and forgiving, filtered through the grimy attic window and drifted over stacked trunks, yellowed newspapers, and a solitary porcelain doll whose cracked face still held a faint, knowing smile, as though it had seen the unsaid truths of generations passing below. In the far corner, obscured beneath a fraying quilt that once was white but now resembled newspaper grey, she spotted an unremarkable wooden box, rough-hewn, its latch tarnished, its surface dust-laden, and with a trembling hand and a resolved breath, she flipped the latch open, the wood protesting with a long, rusty creak, and discovered rows of old black-and-white photographs that seemed frozen in collective memory. Grainy portraits, a railway station, shattered facades, the edge of a harbour, and in nearly every frame stood the same serious young man in uniform, his gaze steady, reserved, compelling her own heart to still. He could have been any soldier from any small American town, yet there was a gravity to him that spoke of unspoken stories, of a life that had intersected theirs without their knowing, of a presence so persistent it demanded to be known. She flipped through each photo, her throat tightening as the scenes shifted, from bombed-out European streets to quiet docks at dawn, until one image stopped her. Stone Pier and a distant lighthouse she recognized from documentaries about the U.S. Army's campaigns in northern Italy. But could it also have been Halifax or another Allied port? On the reverse, a handwritten note faded with lead pencil. H-12A, Oki, 1945. It was not merely curiosity that seized her, it was a solemn conviction, a sense that beneath the hush of everyday remembrance lay a real story yearning to be resurrected, to echo in all its human imperfection and quiet courage. Margaret's grandmother had been so generous with stories of rationing, of victory gardens, of ships returning in triumph, but she had never uttered a name, never displayed a photograph, never spoken of this man who had once stood among her souvenirs. The silence felt too deliberate now, like the hinge of that weathered attic door, worn, reluctant, but ready for someone to swing it open. Because sometimes the noise of those long-gone voices is not heard in their absence, but in the act of finally listening. If this story moves you like it moved me as I wrote it, please give the video a like and hit subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that resonate, surprise, and inspire. And now, brace yourself, because what you're about to discover will change everything. From the moment she laid eyes on the photographs in the attic, Margaret Lawson felt something shift, not just within the walls of her inside her own understanding of what history really was. She had always taught her students that history was not a series of dates and battles, but stories, intimate, human stories. And now she found herself standing on the threshold of one that felt personal, incomplete, and perhaps deliberately forgotten. That same unknown soldier again and again, in all those black and white frames, his posture firm, his eyes both alert and distant, his uniform unmistakably U.S. Army, kept calling to her in ways she couldn't ignore. She began her search where any American might, with a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Archives in St. Louis, where millions of personnel files were kept. Well, at least the ones that had survived the 1973 fire that had destroyed a large portion of the Army's World War II records. In her letter, she enclosed scans of the photos, highlighted the date marked October 1945 and mentioned the apparent location, possibly Anzio or Livorno, both known Allied staging areas in Italy during the final year of the war. The letter was formal, detailed, and hopeful, though she knew bureaucracy rarely moved fast, especially where ghosts were concerned. While waiting for a reply, Margaret took the logical next step. She contacted the American Battle Monuments Commission, the custodians of overseas military cemeteries and memorials. Their digital database, robust and respectfully maintained, yielded no match for H-12A, the code written on the back of the harbor photograph. But it did give her context, unit codes, shipping logs, and deployment charts. She began to build a mental map, pinning each piece onto the corkboard in her study, not unlike those used in detective dramas she used to binge-watch, but had never imagined living out in her own home. Then came a clue that felt less like evidence and more like memory whispering. In one of the photographs behind the soldier, a partially visible wall bore the faded words, "Camp Patrick Henry." She froze. That wasn't in Europe. That was Virginia, a major staging camp for US soldiers shipping out to the European theater. It was a domestic ghost, not a foreign one. With renewed focus, she visited the Massachusetts National Guard Museum in Worcester and spoke with a retired colonel-turned-historian who, upon examining the photos, remarked, "This isn't just Army. This is Quartermaster Corps. Look at the insignia." He wasn't just a soldier, he was part of the machinery that fed and supplied the front. It made sense. The man didn't appear in action shots. He was always near trains, crates, field kitchens, or ports. In one photo, more candid than the rest, he sat on a wooden crate, sleeves rolled, looking down at a slip of paper in his hand. It wasn't staged. It was someone waiting. For a letter? For orders? For something that never came? Determined, she posted a selection of the photographs on a WE2 veterans forum called Forgotten Frontlines, along with a heartfelt message. "My grandmother left behind dozens of photos of this man. She never mentioned him. We don't know his name, but he seems important. Did anyone serve with him, recognize his face?" 2 days later, she received an email that made her stop breathing. The subject line read, "I knew him. His name was Walter." The message came from a man named Raymond Ray Doyle, a 94-year-old veteran living in upstate New York, who claimed to have served in the same supply division as a soldier named Walter G. Riley. He remembered the face instantly. He was quiet, read Steinbeck, carried a photo of a woman in a summer dress, said he was from Connecticut, disappeared in '46. Nobody ever knew what happened to him. The name matched nothing in the family records, but now she had something tangible. Walter, a state, a year. Through Raymond's stories, a fuller image began to form. Walter wasn't a hero in the conventional sense. He wasn't decorated, wasn't lost in battle. He was, as Ray put it, one of the ones the war forgot to finish with. Someone who came home in body, but maybe not in soul. Margaret began to dig into state archives, veterans' registries, and local newspapers from the late 1940s. Finally, buried in a small-town obituary from 1993, she found a death notice. Walter George Riley, age 73. No surviving family, no military honors requested, cremated. There it was. The end of his timeline. And yet, it felt like just the beginning, because now Margaret knew her grandmother hadn't just known Walter, she had loved him, quietly, privately, without record. These weren't just war photos. They were pieces of something tender, unfinished. A history not of battles, but of hearts that waited. The discovery of the name Walter George Riley didn't bring the comfort Margaret had expected. Instead, it unsettled her in a way she couldn't easily explain, as though a door had creaked open, not just into someone else's life, but deep into the architecture of her own. Her grandmother had always seemed like someone who had lived in quiet absolutes. A patriot, a stoic, a widow who never remarried, never dwelled on the past, and never once alluded to a man named Walter. But now, as Margaret sat in her dining room, with the stack of photographs spread out before her, and Raymond Doyle's recollections playing on loop in her head, she realized something sobering. Sometimes what's not said in a family speaks louder than anything that ever was. She drove across town to see her mother, Eleanor Lawson, 68, soft-spoken, meticulous, a retired school librarian who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and believed deeply in alphabetical order. They sat in the kitchen drinking herbal tea, the kind Eleanor always steeped far too long. Margaret cleared her throat, unfolded one of the photographs of Walter, and asked the question she had carried like a stone in her chest since reading the obituary. "Mom, do you know who this is?" Eleanor studied the image carefully. Her hand stilled on her mug. Her face didn't change, but her breath did. And after a long moment she said, almost inaudibly, "He used to send postcards." But they stopped after a while. That sentence, as simple as it was, cracked open decades of silence. Walter Riley had been part of their family story. Not officially, not in records or scrapbooks or holiday rituals, but in the margins, in the private world of her grandmother's grief. Eleanor explained that he had visited once in 1946, just after the war ended. Margaret had been a baby then. Her father, whom she had always believed to be Elsa's only great love, had entered the picture much later. "I don't think they ever got closure," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wasn't someone you forgot." But she tried. She had to. Back home, Margaret returned to the attic and began sorting through the contents of the wooden box once more, this time with a new lens, not as an archivist, but as a granddaughter, searching for emotional truth. Between a faded ration book and a Victory Bonds flyer, she found a small envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with a now crumbling wax stamp. On the front, written in her grandmother's handwriting, were 4 words. "For Margaret, do not open." She froze. Her name, written decades ago. Her heart pounded. She took the letter downstairs, sat in silence for nearly an hour before daring to touch it, and finally, despite the warning, broke the seal. What she unfolded was a letter from Walter, not to her, but to her grandmother. It was dated September 1st, 1946, postmarked from a veterans recovery hospital in upstate New York. In it, Walter wrote, not like a soldier, but like a man trying to reconcile memory with longing. He thanked Elsa for those brief, impossible days in Boston before the deployment, confessed that he still carried the photo of her tucked in the pages of a Steinbeck novel, and said he had hoped to return, but found that the person he became during the war no longer knew how to come home. "There are men who return with medals, and there are men who return only with silence," he wrote. "I am the second kind." He told her about Clara, a nurse from the Italian front who had patched him up more than once and for a short time shared his days in Anzio. He wrote about how they both tried to forget what they had seen and how they failed. But then he wrote about someone else, a young woman whose name he never gave, a field nurse who died in a bombing raid near Rimini. Walter had held her hand as the life left her. She had been kind, funny, and spoke with a southern accent. He didn't even know if she had family. But before she died, she made him promise to let someone, anyone, know that she was brave and loved, even if only briefly. "I promised her I would carry her memory," Walter wrote. "But I never expected to carry so many others along with it." The final paragraph was barely legible. His handwriting trembled, as if his body was giving out while his mind still burned with everything it had never been able to say. He ended the letter, not with a farewell, but with a sentence that would echo in Margaret's chest for days. "If I never find peace, let me be remembered by someone who believes in forgiveness." Margaret folded the letter slowly, her fingers numb. She realized she hadn't cried, not because she wasn't moved, but because the grief she felt didn't belong to her alone. It belonged to generations who had never known how to ask the right questions or were too afraid of the answers. But now she knew. Walter had been real. His sorrow was real, and so was her grandmother's love. There are letters that change the way we understand the past, and then there are letters that make you feel with unbearable clarity that the past never really left. Margaret Lawson held the fragile pages in her hands, the way one might cradle a living thing, tenderly, reverently, like any sudden pressure might erase the words or the man behind them. Walter's handwriting, slanted and careful, reflected not only his time, a generation raised to write with purpose and restraint, but also the tremor of someone trying to keep his heart from spilling out too fast, too raw, onto paper that could betray him. In his words, Walter painted a picture of the days following VE Day, not with triumph, but with disorientation. He wrote of waking up in hospital tents near Naples with sand still in his boots and the echo of shells still ringing in his ears, of being asked by strangers if he was lucky to have made it out, when what he really wanted was to tell them that survival sometimes didn't feel like a gift. He spoke of Clara, the Italian nurse who had brought him warm broth and worn a blue ribbon in her hair as if it could ward off despair. He admitted that for a while he believed he might marry her, not because he loved her, but because she made the silence bearable. But that chapter passed as quickly as the armistice papers had been signed, and it was then, in the hollowed realm taken more than just bodies, that he met the young woman whose name he never wrote. Margaret read the paragraph over and over, trying to see her, to picture this anonymous American field nurse who had no gravestone, no citation, no lineage left to speak her name. Walter described her not by appearance, but by gesture. She tied her sleeves with twine when bandages ran out. She sang hymns softly under her breath while cleaning wounds. She laughed at his awful handwriting, then helped him write a letter to her own mother that she never mailed. She was from Kentucky or Tennessee. She had said "y'all" and called everyone sir, even the boys younger than her. He didn't write about love in the romantic sense. He wrote about her as something gentler, more sacred, a reminder that even in the collapse of everything, there were still people who chose kindness. In the chaos of a nighttime bombing near Rimini, she had shielded a child from debris with her own body. When Walter found her, she was still breathing. He knelt beside her, applied pressure, whispered that help was coming, but they both knew it wouldn't arrive in time. "She asked me one thing," he wrote, "to tell her mother she had been brave, and to let someone know she had been loved, even if just a little, even if just by me." The simplicity of that final request, so modest, so human, was what undid Margaret. This woman had asked not to be immortalized, not to be remembered as a hero, but to be acknowledged, simply and honestly, for having mattered. That was the weight Walter had carried in the years after, not just survivor's guilt, not just war fatigue, but a promise that never found its home, and perhaps it never would have, if not for this moment. Margaret realized then that her grandmother had never opened the letter, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much. She must have known what it contained, known that it would bring back a grief that had never really healed, just learned to live quietly beside her in the rustle of a curtain or the silence after a hymn. She folded the letter again, this time gently, placing it in an archival sleeve as if to say, "You've done enough. You've carried this long enough. Let someone else take it from here." That night, she wrote in her journal, not for anyone else, not for history, but for herself. He didn't forget her, and now I won't either, because that's what stories are. Not answers, not closure, but bridges between the forgotten and the found, between the ones who left and those who stayed behind, between a nurse who never made it home and a soldier who never stopped hearing her voice. And so, the letter that never arrived finally reached someone. In the weeks that followed her discovery of Walter's letter, Margaret Lawson found herself unable to return to a normal rhythm. Not because she was lost in grief, but because the story she now held was too full, too unfinished, to remain buried in attic boxes and private tears. She felt a responsibility, not only to Walter or even to her grandmother, but to that unnamed field nurse whose last request had echoed across half a century to find someone willing to remember her. She scanned the letter, carefully transcribed its contents, and with a brief but heartfelt introduction, submitted the story to a popular online publication dedicated to wartime memory, The American Storyteller, under the title, The Letter That Sat Sealed for 51 Years. She expected maybe a few kind comments, some shares, but what followed was something else entirely. Emails flooded in. Veterans, descendants, amateur historians, people from Kentucky and Tennessee writing to ask, could she have been my aunt, my cousin, my grandmother's friend? The Department of Veterans Affairs reached out to request a copy for archival review. One message stood out from Ethan Carroll, a historian at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, who wrote, "Your piece struck something in us. We're building a new exhibit called The Silent Service, dedicated to those who were never officially honored, but whose sacrifices kept others alive. Walter's story belongs there, so does hers." Margaret agreed on one condition, that the real man, not just the letter, be found. She renewed her search for Walter George Riley. His death notice had been sparse, cremated, no military honors, no surviving family, but she contacted a local genealogist in Connecticut who found a curious detail. In the 1950s, Walter had listed a next of kin in several Veterans Hospital intake forms, a man named Charles M. Gaines, listed as a roommate and friend. Charles had passed in 1972, but his niece, now in her 80s, remembered Walter well. He was quiet, she said in a phone call, polite, carried a little suitcase full of books, and he had this one photo he kept by the bedside, a woman in a nurse's uniform standing in front of a tent. I asked who she was once. He just said, "She saved me," and I never got to tell her goodbye. The photo, unfortunately, was lost after his death. But Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her. This wasn't just reconstruction. This was retrieval. Pieces of a soul scattered across time were finding one another again. One evening, a message arrived from a man named Cliff J. Mullins, a cemetery manager from rural Pennsylvania. He had read the article and thought it sounded eerily familiar. "We've got an unmarked military grave from 1946. Records list only a service number, G42156. No name. Found near the Appalachian Trail. No family claimed the body. But when we cross-referenced the number with a volunteer at the VA, it traced to Walter G. Riley." Margaret's breath caught. A face among thousands. Found. She traveled to the cemetery 2 days later. The road was long and the sky overcast. As she stepped onto the grounds, rows of identical white markers stretching toward the tree line, she felt her heartbeat settle into something quieter, deeper, almost reverent. Cliff led her to the plot, now freshly cleaned, with a new headstone being prepared. The old marker read only, U.S. Army, 1946. She knelt beside it, placed a copy of the letter sealed in a glass capsule into the soil. Alongside it, she left a new plaque, Walter George Riley, 1920-1993. He remembered what others forgot. And beneath it, for the woman who had no name, no stone, no lineage, she was loved, and now she is remembered. As the breeze picked up, rustling the oaks above, Margaret closed her eyes and felt, for the first time in weeks, a deep and complete stillness. Walter had kept his promise, and so had she. By the time autumn arrived in Somerville, the leaves turning the neighborhood into a mosaic of fire and rust, Margaret Lawson had learned more about silence than she ever had about facts. She no longer thought of history as something found in textbooks or footnotes or perfectly aligned timelines. Instead, she saw it for what it truly was. Fragments of breath and ink and feeling scattered across generations, waiting for someone brave enough to pick them up and hold them close. She had returned to teaching in early October, Her students, curious and bright and addicted to instant everything, now listened differently when she spoke about World War II, because she didn't lecture them anymore. She told them a story about a soldier named Walter, about a letter that waited 51 years to be opened, about a nurse whose name no one remembered until someone decided not to forget. And the students leaned in. Margaret shared parts of Walter's letter in class. She showed the faded photographs. She read aloud the sentence that had stayed with her through everything. There are men who return with medals, and there are men who return only with silence. When she finished, one of the students, a boy named Noah who rarely spoke, asked her quietly, "Miss Lawson, what happened to the nurse?" And Margaret answered the only way she could. She lived in someone's memory, and now she lives in ours. The response was a silence not of emptiness, but of reverence. Later that year, a small exhibit opened at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. A glass case held the sealed letter, Walter's photo, and a blank tag with a single inscription, "For the one who saved lives and didn't ask to be remembered." Margaret stood before it the day it opened, surrounded by veterans, families, students, strangers. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The moment said everything. And when she walked out into the warm Louisiana dusk, she thought of her grandmother, of the attic, the silence, the sealed letter, and whispered, not aloud, but within herself, "He found his way home, Grandma. You both did." Sometimes the heroes we need aren't the ones with parades or medals. Sometimes they are the ones who waited, who wrote, who held a hand in the dark and made a promise to remember. And sometimes, if we listen hard enough, they still speak. All they ever ask of us is not to let their memory fade. We share new stories every day, true stories that move and inspire. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss one.